Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first fantasy football podcast. I'm Chris, and I'm here with two friends.
Hey, I'm the Prez.
I'm Viggs.
And we're going to go over some questions and issues and all-around good fantasy football topics. So let's get this going. Unless you have a comment?
Well, I just want you guys to know that our basic goal here is to just share some of our thoughts with you on how the fantasy football season and the football season in general is going to go, and just kind of give you, a good idea of what to expect when so when you're drafting, you can keep some of this stuff in mind, and hopefully it'll help you guys out.
This is going to be the first of a series of podcasts. Obviously, we're going to have much more detailed information as training camps start. And, we get to see some preseason games, and I'm sure after seeing some more, mock drafts happen and seeing some draft strategies kind of play out, we'll have better information for you. But this is kind of a preliminary idea of what we expect from the upcoming fantasy year.
Right. And on that note, question number 1. Will Peyton Manning return to form in Denver? And we're going to turn this one over to Prez.
All right, well, this is actually a really good question because pretty much everybody in Denver right now is praying that Peyton Manning will be, exactly as he was in Indianapolis, and everybody in that division, other than the Broncos, is praying that he won't. It depends. The answer to the question, in my opinion, depends on how you define return to form. Do I think Peyton Manning is going to put up 49 touchdowns this year? No. I don't think that's remotely possible because he's not in his prime anymore. He wasn't in his prime when he got hurt. But do I think that he is going to be a solid, viable fantasy starter this year? I do. And then my reasoning for that is this. Peyton Manning is in a cushy division this year, and he's Peyton Manning. There's not every day, a multiple-time MVP, is out for a year. There's a lot of cases in history of players going out for a year and not coming back at full strength. But there hasn't been a lot of Peyton Mannings to do that.
Exactly.
And I've never seen Peyton Manning disappoint. I think that he's probably going to lead his Broncos to 9-7, 10-6 year. And I think that Peyton Manning,
could win the division.
Which could probably win the division. And I think that Peyton Manning would be a upper tier, upper middle tier starter for fantasy, probably top 8 or top 10. He's not going to be on the same level as Breeze or Brady or any of those guys anymore.
Of course not.
But I think that Peyton Manning is going to have a decent season fantasy-wise, and he might actually be a good value in the draft because of how low he's going.
True. I think, before I let Adam take the table, I think he's been going around 15, 18, something like that, dollars. I think that's a pretty good deal for him, if you ask me. Especially, you can't get one of the top 3 guys,
Especially since you can certainly take a flyer on him as a backup.
Oh, exactly.
Especially in some drafts, maybe he falls a little even further than that, and still take another decent guy, mid-range guy like a Joe Flacco or a Phil Rivers, and kind of play them off each other and see who does better.
Yeah, you get some trade value out of them too, depending who else you draft.
All right, Adam, what do you think?
Well, I'll tell you this. If you're going to get him as a backup quarterback, well, you're doing amazingly. The guy, obviously, we understand the talent he has and the numbers he's put up in the past. But there are a few kind of mitigating factors that make me believe that I'd be a little worried about making him my kind of number 1 quarterback, my guy to go to war this year. There are a few things. It's one, he's got a totally new offense to work with,
Sure.
And I know he's the general, and I know he has he's a very smart guy and a guy who kind of leads offenses. And basically the year before he got hurt, he was basically running that thing by himself. But it is a new offense with new players, new terminology, new coaches. These are all things you kind of have to. You do have to account for in some way. You don't just pick it up right off the bat.
True.
There's going to be an adjustment period. Another thing is that he doesn't get to play in a dome, for home games anymore. He's going to be outside. And when it gets late, the weather does mitigate a little bit of what his value is. If you actually look at his schedule a little bit, towards the latter part of the year, let's go into December, he's going to be, home against Tampa, then away at Oakland, and then Baltimore, Cleveland, Kansas City. Those last 3 teams, Kansas City isn't going to play much fantasy, but those last couple of teams, those aren't, totally soft defenses there.
Right.
Even Cleveland. Cleveland actually has decent secondary. Baltimore can certainly bring it, and Oakland, division rival. Those teams always play you a little bit harder. And the other thing that people seem to not really be talking about is the fact that he's come off 4 neck surgeries?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
At least that we know of.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What happened? We talk about risk for running quarterbacks and those guys getting hurt. How about a guy who we don't know if he's one hit away from just being done.
True.
You know,
That's a
like
good point.
I'm, you know, like we don't know like what his O line is, and I'm not, you know, he has a little bit of a running game to work with. If you assume Willis McGahee is going to kind of come back to form a little bit, but I think there's just a lot from my point of view, a lot more question marks than answers. If you're gonna get him cheap, like. You know, if you get him
or later round.
later rounds, yeah.
Where do you think? Like third, fourth?
Yeah,
maybe fifth. If he falls, I don't
later.
think he'd fall that far, but
I might.
We
You
don't
know what?
know.
I would let someone else take him because if I'm gonna look for a quarterback position, I'm looking to be make that a strong suit. I'm not looking at Peyton Manning.
So you're
And if I'm not gonna be getting like a top tier guy like a Brady, Breeze, or Rodgers,
Right.
I'm gonna be shooting lower. You know, maybe a guy like Andy Dalton. You know, somewhere along that ilk. I'd rather have somebody like that than a
So,
guy like Peyton Manning, who in my mind has a lot of questions to answer. And yes, I get that he has like a lot of upside, and he could be like a fifth or sixth best quarterback this year. But for me, it's just a few too many questions that I would be comfortable not having the answers to for.
So in essence, you'd rather take a Tony Romo or a Phillip Rivers than a Peyton Manning.
Definitely Tony Romo. Phillip Rivers he's kind of falling off the map for me a little bit too. But yeah, I'd probably rather take him before Peyton.
Okay. So those some good thoughts there. We got our next question. This is a bit of a homer question.
Ooh.
It's what are your thoughts on the Patriots receiving core this season from a fantasy and of course a fan's perspective? Adam?
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, you look at the Patriots shooting core; they have a lot of guys. But in terms of fantasy-wise, I think there's about probably four guys you're looking at. You're looking at Welker, Gronk, Hernandez, and then the new addition of Brandon Lloyd. Okay, we know who Welker is. He's the slot guy. If you're in a PPR league, he's a dream. He's a guy who's going to put up around 100 receptions, get you 1,200 yards, few TDs. He's a guy who sets the tone for that offense. He's Brady's go-to guy in third down situations, even in first down situations. Just a very solid guy.
Now, do you think his contract or his lack of contract will affect his play at all this season?
I mean, he's a professional, and I think if anything, it'll motivate him a little bit more, knowing that look, if he puts up big numbers this year again, then he's going to put the Patriots in kind of a tight spot because that means his franchise tender is going to be upwards of $11 million, and that'll all be guaranteed money. Yeah. So I guess in the if you believe in the contract year sense of the motivation, adding up inflating padding stats, then sure, yeah, you can believe that. But I think he's a professional nonetheless. He'll show up and he'll get the job done in my view. So I don't really view that too much, and I don't think it's a factor for me. For me, Gronk, he just had such a dramatic year that was so unprecedented. You almost wonder if he's just going to trend down a little bit, just by sheer force of he can't possibly do what he did again last year, right? I mean, that doesn't mean he still isn't going to be the number 1 or 2 tight end. I think he will be. It's just that if the touchdowns come back down a little bit, which you would expect,
right.
And if defenses key up on him a little bit more,
I think that opens it up for Aaron Hernandez to have a bigger year this year.
So that's the thing for me. I mean, he's always been a question mark because he's that kind of talent who could break out and have an 800, 900 receiving yard year with double digit touchdowns and could be like a number 3 fantasy tight end, which is insane to think about.
On the same team,
on the same offense is just these guys, but Brady throws the ball a lot, so it's certainly plausible that kind of year could happen for him, especially if other guys are getting attention. Now, for Brandon Lloyd, I think he's really an interesting question. A couple years ago in Denver was the number 1 fantasy wide receiver, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he was. I think he was.
A little bit off year last year, kind of bounced around, got traded it out from Denver. Then he struggled a little bit with St. Louis, put up some okay numbers. Obviously people are excited about the fact he's going to be back with Josh McDaniels, and that's good. And I'm sure he'll be feeling a little bit more comfortable, and having Tom Brady throw you the ball can't hurt as long as you're not Chad Johnson.
As long as you can understand the playbook.
Well, that still boggles my mind. Anywho, he's an interesting guy. I mean, you're probably going to look at him around that kind of mid, in terms of ranking receivers, like the mid-teens to 20s. So you're probably thinking, a good guy for value and could break out this year.
All right, thank you. Now, the Prez.
All right, thanks, guys. I think that I'm just going to try to not be a homer at all in this one and just, go straight for the heart of the matter. And that is that Brady had an amazing year last year, and there's only so much better he can do. He broke Dan Marino's record. I mean, granted, it was broken by Drew Brees as well, but there aren't that many more receiving yards to go around.
Right.
So what we have to do is we have to take that pie and we need to divide it into more pieces. The production can't be the same for these guys. There's going to be slight reductions on everybody. Now, Deion Branch last year, which a lot of people are leaving out, he was 600 yards receiving of that chunk of the pie.
Right, that's true.
Deion Branch is not the number 3 receiver on the team anymore.
He might not even make the team. We don't know.
And what you're going to have to look at is is Gronk going to get 1,300 yards again? Probably not. Is Welker going to get like 14 something?
Odds would say no, but
odds would say no. So you're going to have to take that 5,200 yards that Brady had last year, and you're going to have to, when you divide it amongst the receivers, you're going to have to shave off about probably 300, 400 yards and just put him on top of Branch's 600 and give that 1,000 to Brandon Lloyd. He's probably going to get a 900 to 1,000 yard season this year because he is that much, I'd say 300 yards better per year than Deion Branch is at this point in his career.
Yeah.
And all things assuming equal, that means maybe 200 yards, 1,200 yard season for Welker, maybe 1,100 yard or 1,000 yard season for Gronk. Aaron Hernandez, which a lot of people don't know, 900 yards last year
That's true. A sneaky 900 yards.
Which nobody really noticed. Aaron Hernandez is a great guy, and he is an amazing talent. But there's too much. He's not going to get that again. Look for about 700 yards from him, maybe 750. He's a solid guy. He's going to be using a lot of formations, and I think he's going to have another good year. But I mean, he had like a top 5 tight end year last year, and he was behind Gronk, and we didn't have the weapons we do now. So what I'd look for is this. Brady is going to have a similar year, in my opinion, that he did this year. Did last year. This year he's going to have the same sort of year. Whereas the receivers are all going to kind of drop off a little bit. And that's just an issue you have to take. Now, what I really think you have to look at, though, is the running game.
Yeah.
We were talking more about the receivers, but I think it's important to point out we did lose BenJarvus Green-Ellis, and while he only had 667 yards last year rushing, which is not amazing for a running back, he also did have double-digit touchdowns. And those are going to go to either some or maybe one of those running backs on that roster. Now, I don't know whether it's going to be Ridley. I don't know whether it's going to be Vereen, but Ridley's going for about $8 right now in ESPN auction. I think Vereen's going for like a $1 or $2 flyer. Pick up if you can. They're good sleepers to look at because if one of those ends up as a new BenJarvus Green-Ellis, you're going to be looking at a number 2 running back just on touchdowns alone. We don't run a lot in the Patriot offense, but we do run touchdowns in a lot.
It's true.
And that production has to go somewhere, and I think it's going to go to either Vereen or Ridley. I don't think it's going to be a Dyer Woodhead. So, those two guys, keep an eye out for them. Maybe snag one of them as a sleeper. And other than that, just try to moderate your expectations on all the receivers for this year because they're going to be a little less than they were last year.
Now, would you recommend handcuffing those two, Ridley and Vereen?
I would be tentative about it just because that's going to be 2 bench spaces that you're going to be taking, but it wouldn't be a terrible idea because you'd be trying to guarantee yourself that. But the risk you run is that if it does come down to an even split in terms of the touchdowns, then you got 2 basically worth maybe flex players
at best.
I'd say this: if you're gonna handcuff a running back tandem, I know we're going a little bit off topic. I would pick. There are quite a few other teams I'd rather handcuff together than a team like that who predominantly hasn't run the ball a ton, and they might decide that a more balanced philosophy is fine, but we don't know that yet, and that's something we could look for in training camp and preseason games, see if they show some of that. But
So yeah, to answer your question, I wouldn't necessarily handcuff the 2, but I would just keep an eye out on them. Maybe you might want to take a sleeper pick on Ridley. Maybe you keep a waiver eye out for Vereen if he doesn't get drafted. They're just stuff to look at because one of those guys or possibly both of them are going to get that production that Green-Ellis left behind.
True, so it has to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good. That was a good analysis. We'll talk more about the running back committee situation later on in this podcast, but let's move on to the Madden curse question. Do we think that Megatron is going to quote-unquote defeat the Madden curse? Will he be the one that will survive the Madden curse?
All right, well, first off, what I have to say about Calvin Johnson is this. I haven't seen a receiver in a long time that he's had his level of skill. He's just unstoppable. And as long as Matt Stafford, Stafford stays healthy, I see no reason why he shouldn't repeat. He's an amazing receiver. He has a good quarterback throwing to him. Good pieces around him. I think that he has the if anyone can beat the Madden curse, I think Calvin Johnson's a good candidate. However, I am an avid believer in the Madden curse. I do not doubt its power at all. I think that blaspheming against the Madden curse is a good way to get Calvin Johnson into injured reserve. So what I'm going to say is this. I think that Calvin has a Drew Brees-like Madden curse year. I think that either Matt Stafford gets hurt or he has some sort of injury that limits him, and it's going to be like he's still good, but he's not at his normal levels.
True.
I think maybe you see a couple 100 yards less this year, or maybe less touchdowns, but he's not going to be completely useless or out of the league.
I still think he's arguably the best receiver in the league right now.
No question.
No argument.
No, I think Prez said, if anyone is going to defeat the Madden curse, it's going to have to be someone who's as freakishly athletic as this guy is. I mean, he's an absolute monster. I guess the argument that to make if you think the Madden curse will defeat him is the history of what the Madden curse has done to a lot of other really talented guys who have been on that cover. But there is some precedent to say that he won't just break his leg in some horrific accident week 2. He could have a Larry Fitz type of a year where Larry Fitz was shared a cover.
Yeah, but he only shared the cover.
He shared a cover.
So he got half of the damage.
Well, perhaps. But
I agree with that. Plus, Troy got a good chunk of that too because he was out for the whole season.
That is true. That is true. But
he might have got 25%.
Nevertheless, his face was on the cover, and he didn't have some horrific injury. He just had some terrible quarterback thrown to him, if I remember correctly. Or is that
big drop in production, like 400, 500 yards?
That's what I could see happening.
And I think part of the thing about that is when you're on the Madden covers, it means that you're at the top of your game. And football is such a competitive thing that it's so hard to remain dominant for more than a year at a time, just because there's so many other good talents. You're going to get more attention on you, and he plays in a division where there are a couple of physical defenses like the Bears, and certainly the Packers will get in there and mix it up with him. And and also with Stafford being a little bit injury prone. So there's a lot of risk for a drop off in production, but you certainly don't count on some, like I said, horrific leg injury, and I wouldn't wish on anyone. I just think that it's definitely a powerful thing, that Madden curse. So just watch out. Be a little buyer beware, I would say.
Well said. With that said, I'm probably going to draft him and probably crying to you guys in like week 6. So,
all right,
we'll see. All right, on to the next question. This has been a serious issue this year. All these players getting arrested for whether it's DUIs or I don't know, hood rat things with their friends. I don't know. But how do you think this affects draft status for these Marshawn Lynch's and Des Bryant's and anybody else that's been arrested? Justin Blackmon.
Well, I gotta tell you, I mean, guys like Marshawn Lynch, I think Kenny Britt was one, Des Bryant.
Yeah, Kenny Britt.
These are guys that they're not just scrub guys. You're going to be paying decent chunks of your auction dollars or decent draft picks for. So you gotta just watch the news, and watch to see if what's going on with the courts. And you also have to be aware that Roger Goodell's the sheriff out there right now. He doesn't take any BS from anyone. He will, serve out some suspensions if he feels the need. So you definitely want to be a little bit buyer beware. I definitely think it devalues them. You're probably going to not want to take these guys at their projected draft picks. You'd probably want to shave off, like for Des Bryant, maybe you shave off a few dollars off his auction value, maybe, $5 to $8 worth of, off his auction value, and then maybe take him, a few runs later. Same thing for Kenny Britt. Marshawn Lynch, this is so disappointing because that was a guy who, in my mind, could have been one of a good running back simply because he had a breakout year and certainly didn't have a lot of competition in the backfield, which is pretty rare nowadays. So definitely, my best advice is just be buyer beware, keep track of the news on these guys, and if you really think that Roger Goodell is going to have a reason to suspend these guys or punish them in some way, he's probably going to do it. So just be careful if you're planning on drafting these guys because they're going to have some baggage and you're possibly going to lose some weeks.
Well said.
All right, so basically in terms of whether how that affects their value, I don't have too much to add, and to Adam in terms of obviously it's going to devalue them. What I'd probably give is just a little food for thought in terms of how you might want to go about drafting them, the kind of the logic you want to attach to it. what I'd do if I were you and you're really looking at somebody like a Des Bryant or a Marshawn Lynch is I would just look at past precedent. I'd go back and see exactly what kind of stuff, what kind of damage, that Roger Goodell docked some players who got DUIs in the past.
Right.
And like how many game suspension, if it's like, month suspension, 2-game suspension, and just kind of like, adjust your values for that. If Des Bryant is worth $25 in this year's auction draft, and he's going to miss a fifth of the season, then you shouldn't be paying more for him than like 2021. Because he's not going to be worth 25 anymore. He's
right.
Missing half a season. You're going to miss. If he's missing a fifth of the season, you're missing a fifth of his production. So you got to look at it in a very business-like, very straightforward sense in terms of how much you're getting for him and how much you aren't. Now, I would actually devalue that even more because it's being out of the loop, being out of the out of the game, not with the team for those 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So that's going to take him out of the game plan a little bit. So maybe like $1 or $2 more depending on how much he's worth, but. Whether I think you shouldn't draft those guys, I think what you should look for is actually trying to get those guys at a steal.
Right.
Someone like Des Bryant, he might be worth $23, $24, and you find out that everyone in your league is like avoiding him like the plague, and you get him for $10, then he's definitely worth that $10. Like by far, he's probably worth 18 if he was going for 25. So. Keep that in mind and actually keep those guys on the lookout for steals. I wouldn't take too many of them because you don't want to have like a
team of convicts.
You don't want to have your team like loaded up with people who aren't going to play for the first 2-3 weeks,
right?
Because it'll be kind of tough to win. That's like kind of guaranteed losses. But keep your eye out for them, but make sure you adjust your values accordingly.
Just use your logic, and I think he makes a good point that a lot of times these are where you can have some value for yourself, and if you're in a keeper league where these values sort of hold up for the next season, that could be another reason to try to pick up a guy like this.
Right. I'd also like a Des Bryant case, like maybe you're gonna pick up like a Laurent Robinson to like. Because like his projection is going to go somewhere, right?
Well, right. Robinson's actually in Jacksonville now, though.
Is he really?
Yes.
Yeah,
I missed that. All right. Never mind. Well, but a person like that, you know what I mean?
Right. The logic's sound. I mean, obviously Des Bryant missing a couple weeks is going to add a little bit of value to like Miles Austin and even Jason Witten. But, so that's something to keep in mind. It's a good point.
Okay.
Noted. Anyways, what did we hit? Okay, so then... speaking of... penalties. How about the bounty scandal on the Saints? Is there any Saints players you're going to stay away from because of this scandal? Like, I mean, Drew Brees, you're obviously going to still want him. He's still, like, one of the top 3 quarterbacks. But is there anybody in particular that this bounty scandal affects, like, on the Saints' fantasy value?
I think that you weren't going to draft their defense, and their defense is going to be in shambles. So I think it actually... strangely enough, might give everyone a slight uptick. And the reason why is that their defense is just going to be, it's gone. It's in shambles. A lot of guys suspended, defensive coordinator out, head coach not there for a while. So, organization, I just don't think it's happening. And they weren't a particularly great defense to begin with, but look, they're not going to, I just think they're going to be even worse this year. So, that means you're going to have an offense that's going to be in a lot of more shootout-type situations, which is really good for, the important players like the receivers, Drew Brees, Jimmy Graham, guys like Darren Sproles probably get an uptick. Probably a guy like Mark Ingram gets hurt by this because, you can't really run the ball as much in a shootout. So, I mean, he might get hurt a little bit, but, it's hard. It's kind of one of those things where you have to sort of let the weeks play out for... a week or two, and that to really understand what the implication of it's going to be. But I wouldn't really stay away from it. In fact, I think it gives them a little bit of an uptick.
Okay. Well, building on what Adam said, he's right. The defense is not what you're going to draft anyway, and the defense is going to be bad whether or not this had happened. So, right. In terms of that, making these things a shootout is only going to help Drew Brees. So I think that Drew Brees is going to have a great season again. I can't see. I think people question his leadership because he's never really been called to really lead. He's always been more of a coach guy, unlike a Peyton Manning or a Tom Brady. But I think that he's going to show this year that he has exactly what everybody doubts. I mean, we're not seeing in that locker room, so I'm sure he's just as much of a leader as anybody else. I think that Drew Brees is going to have a great year, as I said. I think that the key players like Jimmy Graham and Marcus Colston, I think they're going to have good years this year. Marcus Colston, I think, is actually going to have a better year than he did last year because Robert Meacham's gone from the wide receiver corps.
True.
The bigger issue I have right now is with the issues in the coaching and the issues in that the running game. I think that the running game is going to suffer, and that includes Darren Sproles. I think that the loss of Carl Nix is going to be huge on both the passing and the running game in terms of getting everything coordinated. You're not going to find a guard that's going to be as good as him to step in, and I think that that's going to affect the running game for both Sproles and Ingram and Pierre Thomas and anybody else they bring in there. I'd actually downgrade all of the running game players a little bit from what people think. Darren Sproles probably the least because he's more involved in the passing game.
True.
But Mark Ingram and Pierre Thomas, I wouldn't draft them, or if I would, I'd do it very low. I think that the key players, Breeze, Graham. Don't shy away from them for a second. I think they're going to be stellar this year. You're going to see another amazing season from them.
Yeah, they still get to play on turf. They still have a really great home crowd, and they still have Drew Brees. So, it obviously it might affect them winning, but we're not talking about winning football games. We're talking about fantasy football here. So, just follow what we're saying, and hopefully...
Yeah, I mean,
hope for the best.
In terms of real life, I think the Saints are going to have trouble, but that's not going to make any difference when it comes down to, on paper points. So
good thing we don't care about real life in the fantasy corner here.
Well, everyone knows that fantasy football is more important, right?
Yeah, it's so much
That's
better.
true. Unless you're a Saints fan.
Unless you're a Saints fan.
Hey.
So this next question we have is a very interesting one. It's the Johnson question, and it's not what you think. It's about Chris, Andre, and Chad. How do you think that they will be able to respond to their current situations?
Okay. Well, first off, I'll just take this one Johnson at a time. You should never handle more than one Johnson.
It's a rule I live by.
I tried to once, and then well for me.
So I'm going to start with the least important of the Johnsons, Chad Johnson.
Oh.
Previously known as Ocho Cinco, but he changed his name recently, so we can call him by his original. I think that Chad Johnson is going to have another disappointing year. Will it be as disappointing as the Patriots? No, because I think they're going to rely on him a little more than they did.
That's possible.
I think they're going to rely on him a little more than they used to. But do I think that he's going to return to Bengals form, or not even Bengals form, but Ocho Cinco,
pre-name change
form? No, I think he's going to, you're going to see maybe a number 3 or flex player at best out of this guy, even though he's going to be the number 1 receiver in that offense, because David Garrard and Matt Moore, I don't trust them to put up solid numbers every week. And honestly, their entire team's going to be in shambles this year.
Oh, yeah.
And Chad Johnson has lost a step. He's not the player he used to be. We saw that a lot with the Patriots last year. Now, is he going to have 15 catches and 150 yards and change or 200 yards? No, he's going to have 600, 700 yards maybe. But I don't think he's going to be a 1,000-yard, 10-touchdown guy.
He's not going to be what Brandon Marshall was. He's not going to...
Hey, you got to remember this. He does run a mean out route.
He does, yeah. So if all
textbook
else fails,
out route.
It's a great out route.
Right, so moving on to the next Johnson, Andre. Andre Johnson is an interesting kind of player because he's been so amazing. He's been so such a freakish athlete.
Right up there with Calvin.
And then last year he had so many issues with his injuries. He was on and off the field, wasn't putting up production. Schaub always is injury prone, so you have questions at quarterback, and even with everyone thought last year was going to be kind of a really big year for him with Arian Foster having just broken out the year before. Sure. So now people aren't just focusing on Andre, and he had the worst season of his career where he actually played, and a lot of people are questioning whether he comes back from that. I think that he does to a degree, but I think that he's lost a lot. He's getting old. I think he probably lost a lot of what he used to be. I think you're still going to see a solid fantasy starter guy. I don't think you're going to see a top 3 wide receiver like you saw. He's going to be top 10, maybe top 8. I don't think, but he's definitely lost a little bit of where he was, and I think when you draft him, you should take that into consideration. Although, from what I've seen in the fantasy drafts, a lot of the values are, fairly accurate. He's worth a lot less than say Larry Fitzgerald or Calvin. And now for the last Johnson we're going to talk about, Chris Johnson. He kind of went into training camp last year, held out, showed up late, late, and then he wasn't really in shape. And for the first couple of games, he was putting up garbage numbers.
Right.
But what people don't really think about is that for the next 8 games of the season, the last 8 games of the season, he was pretty good.
Yes.
He kind of came back to form, but no one really knew because his fantasy season was already garbage. I think what you're going to see from Chris Johnson after a full off season, happy Chris Johnson is a happy Titans team, and I think that he's going to be right back to form. I think he's going to be top 5 fantasy running back this year, and he's going to be explosive. He's going to be that guy who can win you those games, and he's a little bit undervalued in the draft. So he's a good guy to look at, good guy to pick up, and I think that he is going to win a lot of people their league this year if they get him for a good deal.
Now, I pretty much know what you're going to say here, but which Johnson do you want on your team the most?
Which Johnson would I want? Definitely Chris Johnson. I think he's probably the best valued and going to have the biggest impact as a player.
All right. Sounds good. How about you, sir?
Well, let's take it Johnson by Johnson here. Chad Johnson. I don't think he could have performed any worse than he did last year. He was a guy who just couldn't understand the playbook, couldn't get on the field, couldn't do anything for you. This year, he's number one wide receiver, but look at who he's got throwing to him. Look at just, he has there's an okay rushing attack there though, but there's just so many question marks. Like, if you want to pick him up for $1, I think you're wasting $1. You can I would pick this guy up on the waiver wire if he starts doing well, but I'm just not touching him. Sorry.
Agreed.
A guy like Andre Johnson. Okay, here's the thing. Andre Johnson, big name recognition, beast. Guy has all the physical tools you would want in a wide receiver, and in my mind, still top 5 guy. But yeah, like Prez said, he had the injuries last year. Matt Schaub, a little bit injury prone himself. They still have to feed Arian Foster and Ben Tate. They can't just ignore those guys. Those guys are going to get touches too. And he doesn't get a lot of help because he's never really had a great kind of second receiver to take a little bit of pressure off him. And, those guys can take away stats, but those guys help you out too because you don't see a few less double coverages, a few less of those safeties over the top. Those things help you in fantasy. And he doesn't get any of that. He just gets a lot of double teams, and he has to work really, really hard to get his numbers. That being said, I still look for him to be a kind of a top 5 guy. Definitely, the injuries, they are a little bit risky, and certainly there is that a little bit of bust factor there if you think about it, because you're going to be spending first round picks on him. About $50 of money on him probably if you're looking at a lot of ESPN auctions. So definitely some bust factor there, especially if he's a guy who blows out his hamstring in week 8 and then just won't come back. Well, that's $50 down the toilet. So it's a little bit scary there. CJ, Chris Johnson, CJ 2K, or CJ's okay as it was last year. This guy, who do you really think he is? Do you really think he's a guy who showed up out of shape last year, contract holdout, all that nonsense, didn't play behind a very good O-line, didn't have a very good season, obviously, but we know what he is capable of. He's still a young guy. He's got a little bit more stability in his own life. And a little bit more, I think they picked up, Steve Hutchinson for the O-line. A little bit more stability there, too. Look, they're not a great team in Tennessee, but I think they're going to be leaning on him a lot. He's still certainly a top-tier running back. Yes, he has risk. I understand it because you saw the history there last year. But, if he lives up to anything close to his potential, then you're going to get a running back who will really help you in fantasy this year. And you're probably going to get him at, like Prez said, a slight discount, especially against other running backs like a Shady McCoy and Arian Foster and RMGD.
Favorite Johnson?
Definitely, this year I would definitely want Chris Johnson.
Okay. I agree with that. So how about moving on? The success or failure for Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, the law firm in Cincinnati?
It's a tough question here. The thing about the law firm in New England, he didn't fumble the ball, and he got you solid, those 4-yard gains and whatever. He was more of a short yards running back who was used a lot in the red zone. In Cincinnati, he'll be a little bit more featured, a little bit more of a traditional offense, especially with a younger quarterback. I'm sure he'll love handing off to a running back that he can trust not to fumble the football. Coaches love that. He'll keep him on the field. That being said, I think his fantasy value is a little bit limited just because his own skill set is a little bit limited. Yes, he can get you those goal line touches. Yes, he's a good, third down guy. And, obviously the fumbles goes without saying. But that being said, he's about, for me, like a $10 back, maybe $12 back. He's like a flex guy. If you're on a good team, he's a flex guy. On some teams, he would be a bench guy. And as a guy who I root for, I enjoyed watching him in New England. I don't think he's someone who's going to be really swinging your draft one way or another. But that being said, if you're looking for a guy just to create some depth and maybe some sure points for you, if you're just looking for a guy who's going to create a semi-high floor, yeah, that's about what he's going to be, in my opinion.
Okay. So I'll give my take, and luckily it's slightly different than Adam, so it won't be like us repeating each other. The way I look at BenJarvus Green-Ellis, the Bengals recently got rid of Cedric Benson, and Cedric Benson, the one thing you kind of notice about him, he's the style of runner who is slightly bigger than the average runner. He's not super fast and agile, but he has a little bit of physicality. Can't really break one, but he has durability and a little bit of reliability. And those same traits can definitely be attributed to BenJarvus Green-Ellis. Now, assuming that they're planning to use him like they use Cedric, about 300 touches per year. Obviously, if they don't use him as much, then that's going to be another issue. But they still have a young quarterback, still have a young receiver. I think they're going to lean on BenJarvus Green-Ellis for at least 50% of the time when they're out on that field, and I think that's going to come out to about 300 touch a year. And I think what you're going to want to look at is very Cedric Benson-like numbers, which is going to be around 900 yards to 1,000 yards per season and no more than 6 TDs. One thing that was very strange about the Bengals the last couple of years with Cedric Benson, he did not get touchdowns. Cedric Benson was, when they got to that goal line, they either threw it or they used the backups or the fullbacks. They didn't actually run in the running back. And I think that BenJarvus Green-Ellis is going to be in the same situation. A lot of people look at him as like the big, he's going to be the goal line carry guy, and he actually is very good at that.
Yeah.
But so was Benson, and they didn't use him in that way. So I feel like the Bengals, they have a different style of offense than the Patriots do, obviously. And I think that the Patriots only use BenJarvus Green-Ellis for those goal line touches. That's why you're seeing 10 touchdowns a year. You're not going to see that production this year. Maybe a little more yardage because he's going to get more touches, but he's going to have significantly less touchdowns. I would say with a 900-yard back, 6 touchdowns, you're probably looking at either a low-tier second running back or a high-tier flex.
I agree with that. Now, off topic, but do you think his streak is going to end this year? The no fumble streak.
You know what?
Well, you can go ahead.
No, I don't, because this is like something he prides himself on, and I don't think changing teams is going to really affect that one way or the other. I think that's his kind of his MO. He's the guy who's going to protect the rock, and I think he still lives with that sort of innate fear that if I fumble the ball, I get cut, and that's such a it's actually kind of a good thing for him because it's something an offense says, hey, I can give this guy the ball and no, it's not going to get fumbled. That's really a nice thing for coaches to think about. So I don't actually.
I actually disagree. I think that this is the year that streak ends, and this is my reasoning. Basically, BenJarvus Green-Ellis, he got a little over 150 or 160 touches last year, something like that. If he gets 320 touches this year, he's getting twice as many carries as he did last year, and people are going to be trying to strip him every play like they do in every game. But the difference is they're not going to be playing like 10 yards back in coverage like they do against Brady. They're gonna, the linebackers are gonna be looking for him. They're gonna be playing in, and I think that he's probably gonna drop the ball on the ground a few times, and it just has to do with repetition. He's gonna have as many touches this year as he did over the last 2 years of his career, and that's a lot of wear and tear for a guy to take in 1 year. A lot of people say, you get over 300 touches and you're not gonna be the same after that. There's like a fantasy rule: if the guy had over 300, don't take him. I think that the Bengals run their guys into the ground. I think that BenJarvus Green-Ellis is going to be worn down. I think he's still the safest back in football. Maybe 1 or 2 fumbles at most. But I think that this year, if any, is going to be the year where he breaks that.
I do want to say something though. If you're assuming he's going to be used the same way he'd be used in New England, in New England on short yardage, there's a lot of tight fronts, a lot of guys up at the line of scrimmage, a lot of bodies up there. So why wouldn't it could be that he's going to see some similar things. There were some plays where he would run a draw or some kind of off tackle play where maybe not a lot of guys around him, but when you're between tackles, he's fundamentally sound. Put 2 hands on the ball, kind of put your head down there and protect the rock, And
I'm not talking about like the 4th and 2s. Obviously on 4th and 2, both BenJarvus Green-Ellis and the defense are going to be very prepared for that. For people trying to strip. But I'm talking about the average play. The Patriots played like 90% of their plays out of the shotgun or out of like sub formations.
Right.
And the Bengals are going to be playing out of just regular base offenses, and they're going to be running out of them too. Obviously the Patriots did that a lot more recently. They've kind of come into the tight ends, but at the same time they respect Brady more. So the secondary plays back a little bit. I don't know. I think that the Bengals are going to be looking more for Green Ellis. They know he's one of the bigger threats on that offense, at least with his history. And I think that the extra wear and tear is going to get to him. I mean, it's very easy to protect the ball when you're not carrying it that many times. Then when you're one play after another, get back up and run it again. So,
remains to be seen.
Well, we'll find out. So back on the top of running backs, who do you think is going to be the best one this year, and why?
Well, I think it's a tough question. I think that a lot of people would jump to Arian Foster or Ray Rice, but I'm actually going to throw a wild card out here, and I'm going to say that I believe that the best running back this year is going to be LaShawn McCoy.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not the craziest wild card. He was right up in the mix with everybody last year, but I think that LaShawn McCoy is going to be amazing because of not only his involvement in the passing game, but the fact that I think that the Eagles had a down year last year. I mean, everyone had there was the whole dream team thing
fantasy team,
where everyone thought they were going to be awesome.
Dream team.
And then they weren't really as good as they should be. And LaShawn McCoy was really the only one who exceeded his own expectations.
True.
Vic had a down year. The receivers all had down years. But I think that this year's the year where they start putting that together. I mean, they've had a whole year together as the dream team. I think the defense is going to start putting stuff together this year, and I think that's going to help the offense out. I think if Vic stays remotely healthy, I think that'll actually help Shady McCoy out too, because that'll be one more threat that they're going to have to face. I think that LaShawn McCoy had an amazing top 3 year last year. He's going to have at least that this year, if not the number 1 overall year. So we're going to see, obviously, but I feel like there's some questions with Ray Rice and Arian Foster that I don't want to answer. But LaShawn McCoy looks young, he looks fresh, he looks ready to roll. And if I had number 1 pick this year, I would pick LaShawn McCoy.
So in other words, the real Slim Shady will in fact stand up this year.
That is my guess.
How about you, sir?
It's interesting. I do like LaShawn McCoy, former owner. Had a lot of success with him last year. I understand he's pretty good, especially without having Vic around for a number of weeks. I am one of those guys who likes Arian Foster, and here's why. Running back position in its entirety this year, there's gonna be a lot of question marks, pretty much up and down the board. Okay. There's only a few guys who you feel solid with. There's a guy like MJD, certainly McCoy I would feel solid about, or Ray Rice. Here's my take on Arian Foster. My take on Arian Foster, last year he was still one of the top tier running backs despite missing, I think, 3 games due to an injury. A guy who, plays in a pretty conservative offense. Yeah, they do have Andre, but, they are kind of a run-based attack, and that's also their coach just saying, I want to be a little bit more conservative. I'd rather run the ball a little bit more than pass the ball. He's a guy who can do it all. He runs on all 3 downs. He's had great production. He's shown in the past he's great production. And at this point, of all the question marks that are out there, and I think he's, in my mind, the most well-rounded back and the guy who's shown in the past that he can get it done. Now, this would be a totally different question if we had a healthy Adrian Peterson, but, we don't. So we have to kind of anoint somebody. And for me, it's a guy that, if you extrapolated out his numbers for an entire season, he would have been a number 1 running back. And he still put up great numbers in spite of being a little bit limited. So that's my guy.
I mean, my only response would be that the thing I think that everybody should look out for Arian Foster, and I mean, Arian Foster was amazing last year. He's probably going to have an amazing year this year. But I think a lot of people are kind of worried about potential production decrease.
Right.
And there's no way to know that for sure. But what we saw from Ben Tate last year was actually pretty impressive. He had 4 100-yard games last year, and they were all when Arian Foster was healthy, not when he was injured. So it's not like he was just stealing Arian Foster's thunder. What it looks like to me is that they have another back who's even potentially more explosive than Arian Foster, if not, he's definitely. I don't think he's as good overall, but he's kind of like a home run hitter kind of back, and I think that Ben Tate has the potential to steal up to 40% of Arian Foster's carries. And if you see a 40% to 60% instead of like an 80 to 20 this year, I think you're going to have to cut off a little bit of production. And that's why I still think Arian Foster's a top 5 back, but I'm not 100% sure that he's going to be a number 1 because I'm afraid of what Ben Tate could actually take away from him. That said, I think Ben Tate is a decent sleeper pick for later in the draft.
As a flex?
Kind of as like a flex player.
I'll say this. The thing about LaShawn McCoy that would probably worry me a little bit is that last year, whenever you got in goal line situations, within the 5, he didn't do so well. He's not really a power runner. He can run with some power, but he's definitely more of a speed back, a pass catching back. And while there isn't really a vulture that's going to take those carries away, It's just the system that Andy Reid employs, which is a little odd in my opinion. They actually rely on a bit of passing in that situation. Those take away touchdowns from him, where if he had those, he'd probably be like a clear-cut number one, whereas that's kind of his question mark. I am nitpicking, but if we're talking about the number one guy, this is something that you should, you are accounting for a little bit if you're thinking about the number one pick.
No, I agree. There's definitely question marks with every person. I think the biggest question mark you're going to have to look out for this year, and I think, I know you're getting a little bit off topic, but we're still talking about the top running backs in the draft, so I think it's worth venturing into because a lot of people are going to be taking these guys right in the top 5 picks. So I'm going to say that you guys want to be very wary when it comes to picking Maurice Jones-Drew. I know Adam is very big on Maurice Jones-Drew, so he might not agree with me, but my logic in this is, it has to do with past precedents. Maurice Jones-Drew is having issues with Jaguars management on his contract.
It's true.
And last year, Chris Johnson had the same thing, and he blew off the first quarter of the season, and that just that's a very, very big decline in fantasy production. And the issue I have is that he doesn't have Matt Hasselbeck quarterbacking to try to lighten that load for the for the fantasy players. It's it's going to be it's Maurice Jones-Drew's team. Like Blaine Gabbert is not going to to be doing him any favors. He has to be at the top of his game if he wants to make the production he's been doing because he is the only guy they have. I mean, I don't Justin Blackmon, even if he turns out to be good, he has that DUI issue. I'm not really seeing Laurent Robinson as a huge factor or Mercedes Lewis. And Blaine Gabbert hasn't shown me that he can even quarterback in the NFL. Never mind be a solid producer for him and his players.
I'll tell you this though. MJD, yes, the contract thing will scare people, and yes, you really should be watching out for that if you're planning on taking him, because he's going to be a top 5 pick if you're going to take him like that. I will say this, though. Blaine Gabbert, you couldn't do any worse than he did last year, and MJD still put up, top 5 fantasy production. So if Blaine Gabbert shows any improvement, and if they get any type of passing game to take any load off him, I would just only think that would help him.
Oh, yeah, no, I want to be very clear. This is not anti-sentiment against Maurice Jones-Drew. I actually think he's been one of the most solid fantasy players over the last few years. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't for this contract thing, I probably would, I'd have no doubts whatsoever about this guy as a top 3 back. He's reliable, he puts up big numbers, and that's in spite of the fact that his team has always been consistently bad. Mm-hmm. But my issue is, the combination of that contract issue with his situation, as a team. I worry. I'm not saying he's going to do bad. I'm not saying he's going to be a complete flop. What I'm saying is that I'd be more wary. I'm more wary about him than the other top 5 running backs because the other guy, everyone has questions, but I think his are probably the largest.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
I would agree with that.
I heard an interesting fact about him though. I think it might be Adrian Peterson number 1, but he is number 2 in mileage for a running back.
Well, he's been around starting for longer than any of the other top guys.
And his teams relied on him so much, so you got to wonder when's it going to catch up to him? Is it going to be this year? I mean, you got to have that in the back of your head. It might be a little minor thing, but
you're absolutely
you never
correct.
know when the tires are going to blow out.
And they always tend to do it explosively. It's just kind of like the guy's amazing, and the next year he shuts down. Sean Alexander is a good example.
Exactly, yeah.
No, I think
this of him, Larry Johnson, people like that.
This is not again. We're really kind of reiterating. This is not to say that you really shouldn't be not drafting him.
No, he's still gonna be one of the top.
He's definitely
picks,
kind of a tick below like a Ray Rice, an Arian Foster, Sean McCoy, even a Chris Johnson.
I would definitely put Chris Johnson above him.
Yeah, younger guys in their prime,
Yeah, assuming Chris Johnson isn't like the guy we saw last year who just failed.
Well, and in my opinion, my prediction for this year is that he's going to come back to form.
I would hope.
All right, so
we digressed long enough. That was good, though. That was a good combo. Well, let's talk about tight ends. How do you think Gronk and Jimmy Graham should be valued this year? And are there any other tight ends that are on their level that would be a good buy, I guess, for you if you can't spend like $30, $40 or like a top number 1 round pick on those guys?
It's interesting. I don't think last year we just saw 2 guys, Jimmy Graham, Robert Gronkowski, who just put up numbers we've never seen before. So it's just so hard to kind of project and predict what they're going to do. I think if you're in a strength draft, I don't think it would be completely crazy if you had like a late first rounder just to take Gronk. Jimmy Graham is probably close behind, probably second rounder. That being said, I think I've seen some projections in the auction format where he's been Robert Gronkowski's been going for like $40. I think it's a little bit overboard. If you're thinking about him as a tight end, yeah, he's gonna be the number 1 tight end, but you're also paying for production that's probably the equivalent of like maybe a decent a good wide receiver too. So let's you're gonna have a positional advantage if you have one of these guys, but just don't go completely overboard. Like I said, it's gonna be pretty hard to project who they are, and I would love having them on my team, but certainly just be buyer beware. Don't get into you might find yourself in massive bidding wars. You might just want to step back and think to yourself, is this really what I want to put my money in?
Right.
If you don't get these two guys, I would wait. You can get a guy like a Jason Witten, a Vernon Davis. That's fine. You're going to get standard tight end production. But if you want to get some upside, you can wait around for later rounds. I like a guy like Jared Cook out of Tennessee. Guy who has a lot of athletic talent. And, especially with maybe a bit, not a lot of wide receiver help there. The quarterback who's going to be looking for a safety blanket. Look for a guy like that. Maybe you'll pick him for $1. Maybe he'll be this year's Gronk. So, if you're not going to get Gronk or Jimmy Graham, wait. Just wait and just go for a kind of a high upside, low risk kind of guy.
Yeah, spend your money elsewhere. Maybe you'll get a higher wide receiver. I don't know, a good second running back.
I just wouldn't put $40 into any tight end, even if it's Rob Gronkowski.
Well, first off, I'd just like to say that I completely understand why people are valuing them the way they are. In the snake draft format, some people are taking them as early as the second round. I'm not saying that that's completely, that I would do that. I'm just saying that I completely understand the logic. It's that, if you assume that they're going to have the same production this year, then they were, that's where they were.
You're gonna be disappointed.
Well, I mean, that's where they were, in the rankings. And the other, argument is that they're such, far and away above the other tight ends that in a value-based drafting scenario, they would be a lot more worth it at that position because you can, kind of like get somebody who's like a, starting running back worth points, but you get them at the tight end position where people aren't getting points.
Right.
Now, for that said, I think that Gronk and Jimmy Graham are vastly overvalued, especially Gronkowski, because I think that he's going to have, there's so many players on that team now. I can't imagine him, putting the same amount of touchdowns. Like that 17 touchdowns is just ridiculous. But I do think they're both still going to have good years. I think that you're going to want to try to get one of them if you get a good deal on them. But I wouldn't I wouldn't take him in the second round. I wouldn't take him for $40, $45 like some people are trying to take Gronk. That much I wouldn't do. In terms of other tight ends you might want to look out for, there's always a lot of them. There's a lot of younger upside guys. But the one I'd really take a look at this year is Antonio Gates. Now, if you look at the auction values right now on ESPN, Jimmy Graham and Gronk are just far and away sky high value, and Antonio Gates is only worth $12 estimated. That's not that much for a guy who's literally his only offensive piece left in San Diego. Phil Rivers loves Antonio Gates, and yes, he's had injury issues the last few years, no doubt about it. But if he puts, it's been a while since he's put it back together, and I think this year is going to be the year. He's had a long time to recover, and I think that it's not going to be Malcolm Floyd or Robert Meacham over there. I think it's going to be all Antonio Gates. I think you're going to see another 1,000-yard, 8-touchdown season from him. He's going to be a fantasy stud, and for $12, he's going to be completely worth it. Other guys to look at, Jason Witten's going to be a big factor in Dallas, and some of the younger guys, like Adam said, like Jared Cook.
I like Fred Davis.
Sleeper picks, Fred Davis with RG3. They're going to be sleeper picks you're going to want to look out for.
When you're thinking about the tight end position, you're really looking for more. When you get on the lower tier, just looking for opportunity. If you can find a guy who's going to be the clear-cut starter, that's good enough. You're going to pick him up for $1, and you're going to get solid production that other people would be paying, $7, $8, $9 for. So if you're thinking about the value you're getting, and then you can use that value somewhere else, I think that's the way to go.
I agree with that. All right, moving on. Speaking of, let's who's your biggest fantasy sleeper and who's the biggest fantasy bust? Let's give one each.
Okay. Well, I can start that. This is actually ties into the tight end conversation a little bit. Actually, my biggest fantasy sleeper for this year is Jacob Tamme. I think that people are kind of undervaluing Tamme. He's only worth $1 or $2, but there's a lot of familiarity there with Peyton Manning, and if there's one thing that Peyton Manning's done over his career, and that includes when he was a rookie, and it also includes in his heyday when he had the big guys like Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne on the outside, he always takes care of his tight end. Dallas Clark had amazing seasons with Peyton Manning and didn't look all that great without him. Jacob Tamme, when Dallas Clark was hurt, had a pretty damn good season himself, and now he's back with him in Denver. And I think with a receiving core that isn't Marvin Harrison, it isn't Reggie Wayne, you're going to see him leaning on Tamme a lot. and that's going to lead to a big fantasy season for Tammy. I'm not talking top 3 tight end, not talking top 5 tight end. I'm talking maybe top 7, but it's also going to be for $1. So if you're looking for a sleeper tight end that might be like a fantasy starter for literally no money in an auction draft, or like a real late round pick, like end of the draft pick, I think Jacob Tammy could be your guy. But there is a little buyer beware. Obviously, Peyton Manning goes down, Tammy's value completely plummets.
True.
So it really has to come down to with what you think Manning's going to be. I mean, we've already talked about this early in the podcast. You guys know how I stand on Peyton Manning. I think he's going to come back to, if not form, to be a solid starter. And I think that as a result of that, Jacob Tammy is going to be a solid starter as well. But if you think Peyton Manning's going to be kind of flimsy, then I'd steer clear of him. So it all comes down to Peyton Manning's welfare. Now, in terms of the biggest bust, I'm actually going to pick what is a lot of people's fan favorite, but I suppose also a lot of people's big. People kind of expect him to be a bust a little bit, but this is the first year I've bought into it, and that's Michael Turner. Now, like the last couple of years, I think the last 2 years or something like that, there's always been somebody like crying out, "Hey, Michael Turner, he's had 350 touches last year, 330 touches last year. He's going to be a bust this year." I'm saying that this year, from what I saw at the end of at the end of the season last year, I think that that cliff is about that brick wall is about to come up upon him, and I think that this year is when you're going to see it. Huge drop in production. You're going to see either an injury or he's just going to be plain bad. And I think that at the prices people are drafting Michael Turner at, he's still going as like a fantasy number 1 or a fantasy number 2. I would not take him there. I think that he's going to he's going to have issues. This is the year that it all catches up to him, and that Michael Turner is going to be a big bust compared to where he's being drafted.
In this case, you might want to look at a Jaquiz Rodgers, who, if Turner starts to struggle, he finally hits that wall, it might be his time to shine.
Yeah, Rodgers looks pretty good too. Like he wouldn't even be a bad step in. I think he actually has a lot of talent, and he might be able to get some good numbers if Turner, in fact, does hit that wall or goes down with an injury.
So buyer beware of Michael Turner, and if you do take him, I would recommend handcuffing him with Jaquiz Rodgers.
Okay, so in terms of sleeper, also my thought was some guy, probably not like a superstar guy, but this is a guy you're gonna get for like $1, maybe a couple of bucks. This is a guy, Carson Palmer. Carson Palmer last year, people really weren't paying attention, but he actually, in spite of the crazy situation he was dealing with, from coming just not playing football to just all of a sudden coming to the Raiders and just having no training camp, no nothing to work with, actually didn't put up the worst numbers ever. Didn't really work with healthy receivers a lot of the time. He still put up okay production. And I'm not saying he's again a top 5 quarterback, but this is a guy who's gonna have a training camp. In theory, he's gonna have a couple of healthy guys in DHB, Denarius Moore, who aren't terrible receivers to work with. Have an okay running game, a decent hopefully a little bit more stability for himself, and that could be a guy who, for a couple of bucks, could provide a low tier, possibly even a top 10 quarterback production for very cheap money. So I kind of like a guy like that. In terms of fantasy busts, there are a few ways you can go with this. You can look at a guy like Adrian Peterson because for some reason he's being drafted as if you're gonna be making him RB1. I think that's insane. But the way I'm gonna go is Cam Newton. And look, we all know what Cam Newton did last year, and he's one of my favorite players to watch too. He's got all kinds of athletic talent, certainly a Michael Vick prototype, except a little bit more physical, explosive. My issue with him is that towards the latter part of the year, he started having issues at passer because his favorite target, Steve Smith, would just be constantly double-teamed, and there wasn't much of an answer from him. So I don't really know if he's going to have like a real great answer. And by the way, he doesn't have a lot of great receiving options to work with. And when you are a quarterback, you are passing football primarily. We know his running prowess, and which also leads me to believe that there's a little bit of injury factor there for any running quarterback. But I don't see a lot of talent at the wide receiver position, and I don't know if he's gonna be able to put together the answers to help sort of get Steve Smith like off some of those double teams that will. Were kind of hampering him. Because once those are happening, his production went down a lot. And you're going to be paying for a guy who you want to be a top 3 to top 5 quarterback, and you might not be getting that this year. So in terms of the bust factor, I'm looking at Cam Newton, unfortunately. And it hurts me to say.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on Cam Newton. I think that it's going to be a big issue for him and Steve Smith this year in fantasy. They're both overvalued. And one word on Carson Palmer. I actually really like that you brought him up because he is someone that is kind of off everybody's radar. And I completely agree. He's probably, for a buck, he's completely worth it. And, he adds a lot of value to his other receivers, which people don't actually understand. I think you're going to see a decent year from Denarius Moore this year.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even Darius Hayward-Bay, although I felt like Denarius Moore was kind of Carson Palmer's favorite.
Right.
So they're all kind of under-the-radar players. Like the entire Raiders team, except for Darren McFadden, is kind of under the radar. But the thing I'd want, I'd kind of think about with Carson Palmer is I wouldn't, take that suggestion to mean that, you know what I should do? I should draft Carson Palmer as my fantasy starter. There is a lot of questions with Carson Palmer.
Of course.
He's amazing for $1. Definitely worth it as a backup QB. But I'd still take somebody else, even if it's just like, Phil Rivers or Joe Flacco. If you're gonna hope for like, kind of a QB roulette trying to figure out who the best QB is, Carson Palmer's a great addition. You can definitely get him for $1. But I would not, even if he puts up good numbers this year, there's so many questions that I wouldn't put him as, like, he definitely would be overvalued if you were to buy him for more than just that $1 or $2.
Right, and what I mean, and like what Prince is saying, I'm not telling you he's going to be like the top fantasy quarterback this year. I'm just saying for his value, he can provide you a lot more than most $1 players do. So that's just someone to think about. And I think he's definitely got it right. No one's talking about the Raiders for any of their pieces. So and they have some okay pieces to work with if you're willing to dig a little bit.
And that same thing goes for Jacob Tamme, but what I was talking before.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I think he's going to be a top 7 tight end this year, it doesn't mean that I think you should draft him for $10. He's worth $1 right now. I wouldn't spend more than $1 or $2 on him, and he should probably ideally, if he's not your number 2 tight end, you should have a couple of number 2 tight ends to kind of work with to try to hit one that works.
True. Diversify your portfolio. All right, last but definitely not least question, and this is a very interesting one. This probably won't be relevant at all, but we have to have it. Gluten-free Josh Freeman or vegan Arian Foster? Whose diet is more fantasy relevant?
Just for a little background, everybody, both Josh Freeman and Arian Foster very publicly announced changes to their diet for one reason or another. Arian Foster went vegan, and Josh Freeman went gluten-free. So. Adam, I'll let you start with this. This is definitely more of your interest than mine.
Well, it's interesting. Kind of odd diet choices. For me, here's my breakdown. Just a quick summary of the gluten-free diet. It's not going to really restrict you much, except for the grain category. Gluten is a protein, I believe, that is found in most standard grains, like your breads or pastas. There are gluten-free breads, there are gluten-free beers, there are gluten-free pretty much anything. From my point of view, protein intake isn't an issue. You still get all the meats, all the good stuff. Okay, it just cuts out wheat. And for me, I think this will help out Josh Freeman. Maybe provide a little bit more stability in his life. Maybe he just cuts out those glutens. Maybe he doesn't have so much of that stuff going on. Maybe his tummy feels a little bit better. Maybe it puts up better fantasy performance. Veganism, brief summary: no animal products allowed. No eggs, no fish, no meat, none of that. A little bit more restrictive, especially when you're thinking about the protein intake. But, Arian Foster's a professional. I'm sure he has people out there helping him out, making sure he gets the right nutrients. I don't think it affects him either way. I think Josh Freeman's gluten-free diet will actually give you a little bit of fantasy impact.
And strangely enough, I actually agree with Adam, but not for the same reasons. I'm digging back very, very, very far into my knowledge of nutrition and bodybuilding nutrition. I'm going to make quick analysis of these diets and what may come from. Well, first off, let me just rephrase. I think that Josh Freeman will be most positively affected by his diet, or least negatively affected. I do not think Josh Freeman is a better pick than Arian Foster. Exactly. So let's just make sure that we realize that Arian Foster is still the better draft pick. But all right. So in terms of gluten-free. First off, gluten-free isn't really gluten-free. It just means that you can only do a moderate amount, what is considered a safe amount of gluten, which is a very, very small amount of that wheat protein that Adam's talking about. But what that means is there's still other types of carbohydrates you can have. You can still have a very balanced diet of carbohydrates, proteins, and, or when I say carbohydrates, I don't mean vegetables and stuff like that. I'm talking about, the bread type of, the non-gluten bread, stuff like that. And the meats are definitely still involved, which you don't have with veganism. And what you get there is a more balanced protein intake for an athlete. And protein breakdown is hugely important for athletes trying to build muscle, trying to build quickness. And the proteins in meats are casein proteins and the proteins in milk like whey, which you wouldn't get with a vegan diet. Those are actually the most efficient in terms of breaking down for your muscles to use. And the loss of gluten wouldn't affect that, so the gluten-free diet wouldn't hurt Freeman too much. It might actually make him feel better because the issues that he may have with gluten. Now, in terms of Arian Foster, the veganism, it really probably won't affect him that much. A lot of people say that they feel a lot more energetic, with the clean vegan diet. But the issue that I have is that the only protein that Arian Foster can really have is soy protein, and soy protein is among the least efficient proteins for the body to break down and use, which might affect his training and his improvement. And maybe his training camp doesn't go as well this year because of the way he's not getting the protein the same way he used to. Those whey proteins and those casein proteins, people take them for granted, but it's very important to have that healthy mix. And even with soy protein can kind of replace the protein in general in your diet, but it's not as efficient for bodybuilding. It's not as efficient for working out, and it's not as efficient for football training camp. So I'm going to go with, because of the diets and the fact that Josh Freeman is least affected by his diet, I feel like Josh Freeman is going to be least negatively affected rather than necessarily better. But Arian Foster's still a better player.
True.
And I should just point out, I don't mean it to say that Josh Freeman's immediately a number one pick.
That's what he means.
I'm just saying.
I saw his draft order.
Yeah.
It was Josh Freeman because gluten. Arian Foster was last or something.
Just a quick side note, with the gluten-free diet, you're still out vodka. So go vodka.
Noted.
And on that note, thank you for tuning in. We'll be sure to do this again sometime, obviously during the season. I don't know if this will be a weekly thing, but definitely every couple of weeks.
See what happens with it.
We do a fantasy wrap up, but
this is Prez.
This is exciting.
This is Viggs.
This is Chris. Thank you for tuning in, and
we'll see you next time.
Stay classy.
Later.
Good luck in your drafts, guys.